You'd asked me if I ever thought I'd be sitting in a doctor's clinic waiting to find out if I was pregnant or not. I'd have laughed in your face. No 14-year-old ever wants to be in that kind of situation, and yet that's exactly where I found myself. It was one of those bright spring days, and I had to look at my feet because the sun was shining directly into my eyes. And, okay, I'll admit it, I was nervous. I looked up, squinting slightly, and the doctor was standing there, staring at me. He looked nervous too. Did that mean I really was pregnant? Sweat began to trickle down my back, and I could feel my skin burning up. He asked me to follow him into the room, and without even looking at me, asked me to sit down. Avril, I'm afraid I have some bad news. Hot tears were prickling in my eyes as he told me that. And then I was stopped in my tracks. It appears that you are suffering from a rare hormonal disorder. Although you are only 14, according to your test results, you are in fact biologically closer to the age of 63. What this means is that I didn't hear anything else he said. What did he mean? The room was spinning and I felt like I was going to pass out. 63? 63 years old? Wait, did that mean I wasn't pregnant? I must have started crying because the next thing I knew, the doctor was sitting next to me, telling me it was going to be okay, and that there were researchers who specialized in this kind of disorder. I couldn't believe I'd thought I was pregnant, when, in fact, this was pretty much the opposite news. He went on to explain that I'd basically undergone early menopause, and that was why I was no longer getting my period, and had been experiencing these hot flushes. Even at that moment, as he told me all of this, I was experiencing my worst hot flush to date. I felt like someone had dipped me into a fire. That's how much I was sweating and burning up. He told me I should have brought a parent or guardian with me because legally I couldn't pick up the medicine he wanted to prescribe me without an adult. Everything he said to me was so confusing, and all I wanted was to run away. Why couldn't I be normal like every other girl my age? It's crazy when I think about it because when I first got my period, I thought I was dying. And I remember saying to my friend Jessie that I wished I would never have another one. That's how painful it was. It felt like I was bleeding to death. And yet, as I walked away from the doctor's clinic, all I wanted was to get my period. Things could change so fast, and I cursed myself for wishing them away like that. Worse than hearing that I would never have children was the fact I had to tell my mom. I mean, without her, I wouldn't be able to get the hormone replacement pills. But what difference would they make anyway? I was a freak. How did my life come to this? A couple of months ago, I was just a normal teenage girl, complaining about school, crushing on boys, and hanging out with my friends. And now I was some old woman trapped in a young girl's body. Nothing could be worse than this, I told myself as I walked home, trying to drown out my feelings with loud music playing in my ears. And to think I'd been so naive to believe that I was pregnant. I mean, get a grip, Avril. I had put off going to the doctor for so long because I was so paranoid about it. The weird symptoms I'd been having started about 6 months ago. At first, my period disappeared. Then I started sweating a lot, and I could barely sleep because I just felt hot all the time, even in the middle of winter. I thought it was all in my head, but the more I thought about it, the more my body felt different inside. I stupidly mentioned it to Jessie one weekend when she was staying over, and she was like, Avril, maybe you're pregnant. My cousin told me this story where a girl went swimming with some boys and she got pregnant. Like, for reals. I just laughed. I mean, come on. No one gets pregnant from that, right? Well, sooner or later, I started to believe it. I Googled my symptoms and everything pointed to pregnancy. I didn't want to go out and buy a test because I was sure the lady in the pharmacy would judge me. So that's why I went to see the doctor. I don't know what news I would have preferred, to be pregnant or this. When I got home, my mom's car was in the driveway. I had to pretend I'd been at school, even though I'd snuck out at lunchtime for my appointment. I walked in, my heart pounding with fear. What if she could tell something was wrong? Luckily for me, she was on a call, and so I slipped up to my room without her so much as even noticing. Once inside, I sank onto my bed and cried. I cried for how awful I felt, how scared I was to tell my mom, and then what about my friends? What would they even think of me? Suddenly, something I hadn't even thought of flickered through my head. Was I going to die? The doctor had said I was biologically similar to that of a 63-year-old. So what? Was I going to die in like 10 to 15 years? I wanted to punch something. This wasn't fair. I was only 14 years old. I had my whole life ahead of me, or at least so I thought. That night, I didn't even want to eat. I felt so empty inside. And I guess I was empty, right? There were no babies in there, no eggs waiting to become babies one day. I might as well be dead. I closed my eyes and climbed under the covers. I knew I wouldn't sleep, but maybe if I slept, I'd wake up and realize this was just one big horrible nightmare, and I was actually a normal girl after all. 5 minutes later, my mom's voice echoed through the house. I tried to block it out, but then I realized she was calling me. I really didn't want to deal with whatever problem she had right now, but if I didn't go down, she'd just continue to shout. My mom was pretty highly strung, being a single mom and having a busy job. She didn't exactly have the easiest time. I went downstairs, quickly glancing in the mirror to make sure my eyes weren't too swollen from all the crying. She was waiting at the bottom of the stairs and she had this manic look in her eyes. Had she been drinking? I knew she drank a lot these days due to stress, but this was something more. As she shouted at me, she almost spat. "Why on earth would you think it's okay to skip school, young lady? A little birdie told me she saw you at the doctor's clinic. What have you got to say about that? Something you're not telling me, is there?" I just stared at her. She had her hands on her hips and suddenly I felt so small and helpless. In a small voice, I told her I didn't want to talk about it. I expected her to leave me be, but instead she grabbed me by the arm and dragged me through to the lounge. "Tell me what's wrong right now or you're grounded," she yelled at me. "Mom, well, it's complicated." Then I burst into tears. Through my heaving sobs, I told her how I wasn't able to have kids, that I'd gone to the doctor because I'd been feeling weird. I didn't tell her the part about where I thought I'd been pregnant. She would have killed me. I then went on to explain that I needed her to sign something so that I could take hormone replacement pills for my menopause. Menopause? You what? You mean I'll never be a grandma? You are a disgrace. What is wrong with you? And at that, she also burst into tears. I couldn't believe her. I just told her I had some weird disorder, and all she was concerned about was that she wouldn't ever be a grandma. I ran to my room and slammed the door. My mom was acting like the most selfish person in the world. How was I even related to her? Later that night, there was a knock on my door. It was my mom. I didn't want to see her, but she came in anyway. She was still crying, and she started apologizing, saying it was her fault and that she felt so guilty. I didn't understand. She said that during the pregnancy with me, she had continued to drink, even though she knew it was wrong, and maybe she was somehow responsible for the disorder I had. I turned to her and told her to stop it. It wasn't her fault. The doctor said this was a rare disorder, but it was no one's fault. It just happened, and unfortunately, I was one of the unlucky ones. I knew there was no point in holding a grudge with Mom. I could die soon, I thought, and that's when I realized I couldn't live like this. I needed more information. The next day, Mom and I went to see the doctor, and he explained everything. I would need to take the hormone pills for the rest of my life. When he said this, I interrupted him and said, "Oh, what, you mean for the next 10 years? Because I'm going to die then, aren't I?" Both the doctor and my mom stared at me in horror, and then the doctor actually laughed. "Die?" he said. Avril, no dear. This is a serious hormone issue, but you aren't going to die. Yes, biologically you are 63, but you will still live to be a ripe old lady. And who knows, by the time you're 20, there might be some miracle cure to solve this. Don't give up hope. Easy for him to say. He wasn't the one with empty ovaries and the prospect of a future without kids. I felt like I'd been forced to grow up. I'd gone from being carefree to someone who had skipped womanhood. I was old inside. No one would ever want to date me. I'd be the laughingstock at school. As if being a teenager wasn't already challenging enough. I was grateful Mom was there because she appeared to understand more than I did. The doctor asked us to wait outside for my prescription to be ready and asked me to come see him again in 1 month's time. We waited in silence. The doctor was seeing another patient and he told us he wouldn't be long. After about 10 minutes, the door opened and an old lady shuffled out. She looked at me and smiled and said, "Chin up, dearie. Life can't be that bad, can it? Look at me. I'm 89 and I'm dying, but hey, I'm still smiling." I blinked and just nodded at her. I closed my eyes for a second and tried to gather my thoughts. When I opened them, she was gone, and Mom was standing there with her hand out. "Come on, love, let's get your medicine and get you home. You're going to be okay, I promise." And I believed her. At that moment, I believed her. I knew I'd be okay, because honestly, there is always someone out there who is dealing with something much worse than you are. Besides, I'm still too young to think about babies. I mean, I'm sure that in 15 years I can adopt a baby, or maybe they'll find a cure. Maybe even men would be able to give birth. Anyway, who knows what will happen? And from that day onwards, I decided to adopt an attitude like that old lady had.
Hi, I am Lauren. The story I'm about to share with you is about something that struck me the moment I discovered it. I really had no idea how I should behave then, and I think anyone in my shoes would have gone speechless too. So, a few months ago, my dad drove me to my best friend Diana's house for her birthday party. He insisted on entering with me to wish her a happy birthday. I was embarrassed, really embarrassed. I mean, I am 15, and Diana invited almost everyone I know. I didn't want them to go around saying that my dad had joined me at my friend's party. Anyway, he walked into the house with me, wished her a happy birthday, and spent the rest of the time talking to her mom and laughing together. I was glad that no one noticed him or seemed to care about his existence. But once everyone else had left, I realized that my dad hadn't even asked me to leave yet. I went to the kitchen to find him, and oh my God, I saw him kissing Diana's mom in front of the refrigerator. I hid behind the door, shocked. A little while later, he left the kitchen and asked me if I was ready to leave. My hands were sweating, and everything in me was shaking. But I looked into Dad's eyes and asked him directly, "Are you cheating on Mom?" He looked at me surprised and asked me why I was asking such a question, and then I told him that I'd seen him kissing Diana's mom a moment ago. He was silent for a bit, and then answered, "No, I am not cheating on your mom. She knows about this. Honestly, your mom and I decided to go our separate ways." Wait, what? This was bigger than anything I could grasp. First, I saw Dad kissing another woman and knew he was having an affair. And then I found out he and Mom wanted to break up? No! As soon as we got home, I ran to my mom's room and asked for an explanation. She told me that she and Dad were not attracted to each other anymore, and hence were allowing each other to date other people. She then told me that they wanted to separate so that they could continue their lives the way they each wished. My mom was convinced that this was the best for everyone and asked me to accept that too. It might seem really weird, but this was how I have always known my parents, to be very understanding. And yes, they do deserve to pursue the life path they want. It was hard for me to accept this at first, but I have succeeded. Today, they're divorced. I live with my mom, and my dad and his new lover visit us weekly.
Hi there, I'm Eleanor, and my story today is a bit different. You see, I have done something crazy. It all started last year when Grandma had a bad fall at home. She was 86, and for her age, she was pretty fit. But one day she was doing a spot of gardening, and she tripped and fell. If she had been younger, she'd have been fine. But unfortunately, she dislocated her hip and broke her wrist. And my parents decided it would be better if she moved into a nursing facility. Well, let me tell you, that conversation did not go down well. My grandma is a pretty fiery woman, and she's as stubborn as an ox. So the look upon her face when my dad said she'd have to move into a nursing home was priceless. She crossed her arms in front of her chest and refused to speak to him for the rest of the week. Dad seemed properly upset. I think it bothered him how stubborn Grandma was. Little did he know he was pretty similar to her, and this was why there was always so much tension between them. But it seemed like there was something else going on too. I mean, Dad and Grandma argued a lot, but recently Dad had really been giving her the cold shoulder, and I couldn't help but wonder about the reason. Had Dad done something to upset her? She'll do anything to avoid moving into the nursing home. Well, we'll see about that. And with that, he drove in the direction of the nursing home, and without even getting Grandma's consent, paid a deposit on a room and said she'd be moving in the following day. What was my dad playing at? He didn't even care, he said. He'd drag her there kicking and screaming if he had to. The next day, that was pretty much what happened. And as Dad dropped her off, she turned to him and said, "Son, you're a disgrace. Don't show your face around here again." Well, he tried to visit, but every time the nurse would turn him away, saying that Grandma was feeling sensitive and had specifically requested not to let him into her room. I went all the time. Grandma and I had always been close, and I guess I felt sorry for her. She looked very sad. I asked her if she was okay, and she leaned in close to my ear and whispered something that freaked me out. She said the care staff were abusive, and just that morning they'd run her a scalding hot bath and burnt her arm without even caring. When I looked down at her arm, sure enough, it was red and looked really painful. Unbelievable! How could they treat her like that? I was furious, and I stood up to go and have a word with the head carer on duty. Just as I was standing up to go, Grandma grabbed the back of my dress and pulled me back. She begged me not to say anything, as she was afraid they'd hurt her more if I complained. This was outrageous. I couldn't leave my grandma in a place like this. What would they do next? I decided I'd stay around for a few hours and keep an eye on them. We continued to play chess, and nothing much happened. Just as I was about to leave, though, I overheard one of the male carers laughing and making fun of someone called Esme. My grandma had mentioned an Esme before, and I remembered it was the woman in the room next door. So not only were they careless about how they treated the residents, they were also mocking them behind their backs. Wait until my dad heard about this. Oh boy, he'd be seething with anger. I got up to leave as it was getting late, and my grandma asked me if I could do her a favor. I assumed she wanted me to keep this a secret from my dad, but instead, she asked me to do something insane. She asked me to help her sneak out of the home, so basically she wanted me to kidnap her. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but then I looked at the red skin on her arm, and I realized it was obvious. Of course I'd kidnap her. The next day I came back and we planned it all. The carers and nurses knew how much my grandma loved gardening, so in the afternoon when a lot of the other residents were napping, I took Grandma in a wheelchair through the grounds of the home. I had to give it to the home. They really did have a beautiful garden. And I knew that at the very bottom of the garden, there was a little gate that led to the road, where we could make our escape. The place didn't have much security because I don't think old people often thought about running away, so I was sure our plan would work. We pretended to look at all the plants as we headed towards the gate, and the whole time my grandma was giggling like a schoolgirl. She was so excited to get out of there, and I couldn't blame her. I'd want to run away from those horrible carers too. I was sweating due to the nerves, even though it was a pretty chilly day, but we made it to the other side without so much as even a bird noticing us. Grandma was free. Luckily, I had got my license 6 months ago, and Dad had bought me a car for my 16th birthday, so we dumped the wheelchair outside the gate, and I helped Grandma into the front seat. Well, that was mistake number 1. In all the excitement, we hadn't really thought it through clearly, and didn't think that someone would spot the wheelchair and then contact the home and report it. But that only happened later. The first thing Grandma wanted to do was go for ice cream, and so we drove straight there, and then ordered 3 scoops each before heading to the beach to dip our toes in the ocean. Grandma looked so blissful. It was really nice to see her like that. I asked her what she wanted to do next, and she said she wanted to go for burgers at her favorite restaurant. She said she missed fast food, and that she was starving because the nursing home barely fed her. We ordered burgers, fries, milkshakes, and once again, Grandma looked so happy. It felt like old times. But then my phone started ringing, and I panicked. It was Mom. I didn't answer, but she called again and again. On the 4th time, I decided I better answer. I didn't want her to suspect anything. As soon as I answered, Mom started shouting and said the nursing home had called and Grandma had disappeared, and did I know where she was? I have never been a good actor, so there was no way I could lie to her. I told her we were just driving in my car, but we'd be heading back soon and no one need worry. Well, my mom isn't stupid. She clearly heard the infamous music that particular diner always played, and I knew we had about 10 minutes to get out of there before she arrived. Grandma didn't seem too fazed, which was weird to me. I ran to the restroom and told her to finish her food quickly. When I came back, she had a wild smile on her face. "What have you done now, Grandma?" I asked her. I could see she'd been on my phone. She wouldn't tell me though. She just kept smiling in a sneaky way. This was all a bit strange. Shouldn't she have been worried about what Mom and Dad would say? I didn't want her to have to return to that awful nursing home. As soon as Mom arrived, I'd tell her about the hot bath and how cruel the staff were. I saw Mom park up outside, and Dad was there too. Oh no! He'd go bonkers at Grandma. I gathered up our stuff and Grandma paid the bill. It was time to face up to reality. We had a great day, but now we were in big trouble. I just knew it. Before we'd even opened the diner door, Dad was marching towards us with a grim expression plastered across his face. I'd be grounded for the rest of my life. What do you think you're doing, Mom? He shouted. And you too, Eleanor. You are in deep trouble, my girl. Mom, get in the car at once. I'm taking you back to the home. But then Grandma just laughed, and I found myself speaking up. I told Mom and Dad everything that had happened, and they just looked at me, not buying it at all. Grandma started blushing, and she said she'd made it up, just so that she could get out of there. She said they actually treated her very well, but she just didn't want to be there, and that there was somewhere else she would rather be. I couldn't believe she'd lied to me. Why? Then she said there was something else she'd been meaning to tell me, but before she could, Dad started shouting. Oh, stop it, Mom. Look, you either move in with us or you're going back to the nursing home. There's no one else who can look after you, and don't even think about mentioning that gym guy, Dad barked. I'll look after her, a voice somewhere behind Dad said. We all turned to look, and standing right there behind Dad was an elderly man, grinning from ear to ear, car keys jingling in his hand. Who was this man? And who was Jim? I was so shocked. And then Grandma started laughing and walked towards him and gave him a big kiss on the cheek. So that was who she'd called on my phone when I was in the restroom. But who was he? Then my dad shook his head and said, Oh no, is this that Jim fellow then? See, son, I told you Jim was a good man, and yet you didn't believe me. It's been 5 years since your dad passed away, and I like to think that he'd be happy I've moved on and found someone as lovely as Jim. Now please don't be rude. Come and say hi. Well, you should have seen Dad's face. His jaw almost touched the ground. I just stood there staring. Did this mean Grandma had a boyfriend? I didn't even have one. My grandma was seriously full of surprises, telling me that the carers were treating her badly just so she could escape and be with Jim. Hilarious. I had no idea my grandma was so naughty. And also, I had no idea that my parents had known all along. But hang on, that meant Dad had put her in the home to keep her away from Jim? But that made no sense. Wait a second, I shouted. Dad, did you seriously put Grandma in a home so she wouldn't be able to move in with Jim? But why? Why would you do that? That's not fair at all. Grandma is a grown woman and she can make her own decisions. Then things got really awkward and Dad started shouting at Grandma. And then Mom was shouting at Dad. And I just stood there and looked at Jim and shrugged my shoulders. I walked over to him and shook his hand and introduced myself. Then I apologized for our family being so crazy. And he just laughed and said his family was exactly the same. Then I went back over to Dad and Grandma and told Dad to stop acting like a child and let Grandma do what she liked. I said she seemed so excited that Jim had arrived and that I hadn't seen her this happy in weeks. Dad was super hesitant to let Grandma go with Jim, but as you've probably realized by now, my grandma wasn't about to listen to her son. So off she went with Jim, and I've never seen her look so happy. Did you enjoy my story? My grandma is pretty cool, huh?